Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today we're buckling up for a truly incredible, multi-front breakdown of ancient military innovation, sudden chaos, and some really high-stakes crisis management. We're going to examine Julius Caesar's campaigns in Gaul, but specifically, we're zooming in on a moment when the Roman military machine was pushed to its absolute limits across four completely different, brutal environments. Honestly, if you want to understand how empires survive sudden, catastrophic threats, this is absolutely The Explainer for you.
Okay, let's dive right into this and map out our ground. First up, we'll establish this sudden war on all fronts. Then we head into the freezing peaks for survival in the Alps, followed by a massive Atlantic naval clash. After that, we'll look at deception and southern conquests before wrapping things up in the unconquered forests.
So, let's kick things off with Section 1, a war on all fronts and the illusion of tranquility. Picture this. You're Julius Caesar. You've just defeated the Belgaea, you've expelled the Germans, and you're thinking, okay, Gaul is pacified. We can breathe a sigh of relief. But then, as the source text puts it so simply, yet ominously, a sudden war sprang up in Gaul. Just like that, the illusion of peace shatters almost overnight. And you have to understand, this wasn't just some localized minor rebellion. Suddenly, the Romans are fighting for their very survival across these distinct, geographically isolated theaters. It's literally an absolute strategic nightmare for any commander.
So, the crucial point we need to grasp here is the sheer, simultaneous scale of these threats. You've got Servius Galba trapped way up in the Alps fighting the Varigri and Sidoni. You've got Caesar himself forced into a naval war on the Atlantic coast against the Veneti. Meanwhile, up north, Titurius Sabinus is dealing with the Unelli. And down south in Aquitania, Publius Crassus is facing the Sotiatus and their massive allied forces. Four commanders, four entirely different environments happening all at the exact same time. Let's break down exactly how they handled it, starting with Galba.
Moving right along to Section 2, Survival in the Alps and Galba's desperate stand.
Right, so Galba had been sent with the 12th Legion to open up these merchant routes, basically setting up winter quarters in a valley shared with the local Gauls. Now what's really interesting here is how incredibly fast this situation deteriorates. Just days earlier, peace was concluded, hostages were taken, everything seemed fine. But the Gauls really despised this small, understrength Roman legion, and they deeply resented having their children taken as hostages. So under the cover of night, they secretly abandoned their half of the town. Boom! By morning, the Romans wake up to find the surrounding high mountains just swarming with an enemy force of over 30,000 men. The Gauls rush down, hurling stones and darts, and by the 6th hour of continuous, brutal fighting, Roman weapons are literally failing. The enemy is constantly rotating in fresh troops, and the Romans are so utterly exhausted they can't even pull their own wounded off the line. They are completely trapped in this valley, heavily outnumbered, with zero hope of reinforcements.
Facing total annihilation, Galba centurions suggest one final, completely desperate option: the last resort. Galba tells his men to just stop fighting for a second, just block the incoming weapons, catch your breath. Then, right on his signal, they launch a sudden, all-out sally from every single camp gate at once. The enemy is caught entirely off guard. The historical record actually notes that the Romans surrounded and slaughtered more than a third of those 30,000 attackers. That's over 10,000 casualties in a single counterattack. The rest absolutely panicked and fled back into the mountains. And after that, well, unwilling to push his luck any further, Galba systematically burns the village to the ground and retreats safely back to the province.
All right, shifting gears to the west for Section 3, the Atlantic naval clash, speed versus oak.
While Galba is fighting for his life in the snow, a massive crisis erupts on the Atlantic coast when a seafaring tribe, the Veneti, kidnap Roman ambassadors. Now Caesar is facing a naval war on the stormy open ocean. And this brilliantly illustrates a total clash of engineering styles. You see, the Roman fleet was built for the much calmer Mediterranean. They had flatter keels, they relied on rowers for speed, and they had a pretty low deck height. The Veneti fleet, on the other hand, was built to survive the brutal Atlantic storms. Their ships were crafted from solid oak, bolted together with iron spikes as thick as a man's thumb. They used heavy skins and leather for sails, and their prows and sterns towered over the water. The Romans quickly figured out that their go-to tactic, ramming enemy ships with their bronze beaks, was completely useless against these floating oak fortresses. The Veneti ships were just too strong to ram and way too high to effectively throw weapons up onto.
So the Romans desperately needed a counter-tactic, and they engineered a brilliant solution right on the fly. They attached these really sharp hooks to the ends of long poles. Here was the play. Step 1. The Romans rowed in close and used these hooks to catch the ropes fastening the Veneti sail yards to their masts. Step 2. The Roman rowers vigorously impelled their ships away, pulling with everything they had. Step 3. That massive tension severed the ropes, bringing those heavy leather sails crashing down. It was a real game changer. Because the Veneti ships relied entirely on the wind and their sails, this instantly stripped them of all their mobility. Basically, it transformed the battle from a complex naval maneuvering contest into a straight-up boarding action, where Roman infantry discipline easily won the day.
Without their fleet, the Veneti had absolutely no way to defend their coastal towns or even evacuate them. They were beaten and surrendered themselves and all their possessions to Caesar. According to the texts, Caesar decided to inflict a remarkably severe punishment here, essentially to ensure that the rights of ambassadors were respected by other tribes going forward. He ordered their entire Senate put to death and sold the rest of the population into slavery. It is objectively a brutal application of strategic deterrence.
Let's head to Section 4, Deception and Southern Conquests, the Art of Outsmarting.
Pivoting away from brute force and engineering, let's look at the northern front. Here, Titurius Sabinus was heavily outnumbered by a massive rebel army led by a commander named Viridovix. So Sabinus decides to enact an absolute psychological masterclass. He keeps his army firmly locked inside their camp, projecting this intense image of weakness and cowardice. He actually even lets the enemy come right up to the ramparts just to taunt them. Then, he bribes a crafty Gaul to act as a fake deserter. This guy runs over to the enemy camp and feeds them false intel, saying the Romans are terrified and planning to secretly slip away that very night. Well, the enemy takes the bait hook, line, and sinker. Eager for an easy slaughter, they grab bundles of brushwood to fill in the Roman trenches and sprint uphill toward the camp. But by the time they get there, they are completely breathless and encumbered. Sabinus immediately orders a sally from 2 gates, and this exhausted enemy force is slaughtered before they can even make a stand.
Meanwhile, way down south in Aquitania, Publius Crassus was fighting a completely different kind of war. And I just have to pause and highlight this totally fascinating cultural detail from the text. During one of his sieges, Crassus encountered a leader guarded by 600 incredibly devoted followers known as the Solduri. The pact of the Solduri was intense. It meant they shared all the conveniences of life with their leader. But, and here's the kicker, if that leader died, they were oath-bound to commit suicide. It really underscores the fierce, deeply cultural resistance Crassus was up against in this southern theater.
This resistance culminated when Crassus found himself staring down an enemy host 50,000 strong. To put that into perspective, that is a massive army, and it was led by experienced commanders who had actually fought the Romans before in Spain. Now, these commanders refused to fight a traditional pitched battle. Instead, they fortified a camp and tried to just slowly starve Crassus out. But Crassus noticed a fatal flaw. Their camp's rear gate, the Decuman Gate, was really poorly guarded. So he secretly sent 4 fresh cohorts on this long, sweeping flanking march around the back. They totally smashed through the rear defenses while the main enemy army was distracted at the front. Out of the 50,000 enemies assembled there, the sources state that barely a fourth escaped alive.
Which brings us to our final chapter, Section 5, the Unconquered Forests and the Limits of Empire.
Let's move to the end of this campaign and see how this all builds into a wall that even Caesar couldn't break. With the rest of Gaul seemingly pacified, only 2 tribes, the Morini and the Menapii, remained in arms. But they completely abandoned conventional warfare. Instead, they took all their property and vanished into these continuous, dense forests and deep, treacherous swamps. Whenever the Romans arrived and tried to start building a camp, these tribes would launch sudden, deadly ambush attacks straight out of the tree line against the dispersed soldiers and then just melt back into the woods. Caesar tried to counter this by literally cutting down the forest, taking the timber and piling it up as a massive rampart to protect his flanks. But the tribes, they just retreated even deeper. And then, nature intervened. Severe autumn rainstorms rolled in, making it completely impossible for the soldiers to even stay in their tents. Frustrated, Caesar was ultimately forced to abandon the campaign, settling for just burning some empty villages and laying waste to the farmland before retreating to winter quarters.
And that leaves us at a really profound stopping point. We've seen the Roman military adapt to the freezing Alps, engineer brilliant solutions for towering Atlantic ships, and completely outsmart massive field armies. Yet, after all of that, they were ultimately halted by dense trees, swamps, and rain. It leaves us with a huge question to ponder about the historical limits of military dominance. Can conventional, highly structured armies truly conquer unconventional enemies who are willing to weaponize nature itself? It's a question that empires have struggled with from antiquity right up to the modern day. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive on the Explainer, and we will definitely see you next time.